Okay, I'm testing out this hat in the outside outdoors. And it's kind of windy. It's got to be spinning.
It is spinning.
Is it spinning?
Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I wanted to revisit an old project of mine. This is the flared top hat. It's a top hat that's flared. So I thought it'd be fun to just revisit it, make it a bit more exciting, add some cool accoutrements. I've got a 3D printer now, I can make some cool parts for it. So I was thinking of a theme of sort of like a wind-powered top hat machine. Put like a hole through the center and some fan blades and maybe a smokestack out the side and some rivets and other things, wires, and maybe it could look really cool and fun. So let's give it a go, see if we can make a flared steampunk wind generating top hat.
Alright, so my whole idea was based on a spinning propeller, so I knew I needed to make sure that was working first. I also knew that it wouldn't work very well to make it out of foam, so I decided to 3D print it. I designed all the bits and pieces for printing in a program called 3D Coat, and then sent those lovely files to my 3D printer. I printed off a curved propeller duct, a flat propeller duct, a swirly portal, a regulator thing, spindle caps and wire connector pieces, a bunch of propeller blades and hubs for 4, 5, 6, or 8 blades, cause I just wasn't sure what would look the best and I wanted to see it in real life. I decided I liked 4 blades the best, so that's what I used. I pushed the curved fan duct firmly into the foam where I wanted my propeller to end up. I planned to put a tube between the front and back holes, so it needed to be high enough that it wouldn't hit my head when I put it on. I traced the mark and then repeated the process on the other side, using a measuring tape to make sure I had it in the same spot. Then I cut the holes out with my super sharp knife. The important thing here is not to angle the knife blade out as you go around that vertical curve. Otherwise, when I slide the fan duct in, there's going to be gaps on the side. There were a couple of options for mounting the fan duct. I could mount it with the flat side protruding so it looked kind of like an old headlight or something, or I could have the curved side so it was flush with the front of the hat. My final decision was a little from column A and a little from column B. Curvy, sticky outy. I applied super glue to the 2 duct pieces and held them together until they were glued. I also glued my little wire connector pieces together and the propeller blades into the hub. I wet sanded my parts with 80 grit sandpaper first and then 180 grit. The wet sanding helps keep the plastic from heating up from friction. It also keeps the dust from out of my nose. Now it's time for some black paint on my hand. Actually, what I need to do is paint the inside of the prop duct, because once I start assembling things, I'm not going to be able to get in there very easily. I just want to avoid painting the raised ring on the bottom of the spindle there, because that's where the propeller is going to touch, and I don't want to create extra friction which will slow down the propeller. I also painted the prop but didn't paint the back of the hub for the same reason. To get an antique bronze look, I spread a little bit of metallic paint on a piece of cardboard or paper. I then used my gloved finger to just get a tiny little bit of the paint, which I then rub onto the black painted surface. That way paint is applied to any raised surfaces, but edges and cracks stay darker. Now to get my swirly piece to fit on the other side of the top hat, I need to curve it. Happily I have a heat gun and an old plastic container that's the same curvature as the hat. The swirly piece isn't actually a circle, in fact it's a little bit of an oval to make up for the curve, so it's important to bend it in the proper direction. Just in case you're wondering, the plastic I used to print these parts is PLA, which I totally love how well it bends with heat. I made a 26 centimeter wide rectangle of craft foam in order to make the tube that would fit around the fan duct. I painted one side silver and set it aside to dry. In the meantime, I cut 10 1 centimeter wide strips of craft foam that were at least as tall as the hat. I then glued those strips onto the hat over top of all the vertical seams. Where the strips overlapped the front and back holes, I trimmed them off flush, which was fine for the front hole, but for the back hole, it was a little bit of a mistake. I'll show you why in 37 seconds. I cut the excess off the top of the strips and then cut myself a 2.5 centimeter wide strip, which I'll use to cover up the top corner all the way around the hat. I only applied glue to the bottom half of the strip and left the top half sticking up above the foam. Once I got back to where I started, I cut the end flush. The top's a little bit tricky because it's got to compress as it goes around that curve, so I actually use the heat of the glue gun to warm it up a bit to make it more malleable. Then it's just a matter of continually forcing it to stay in place until the glue cools. I patiently glued a small section at a time until the whole top seam was covered. Now if you remember, I mentioned earlier about making a mistake with the strips at the back of the hat. So I realized when I went to put on the swirly porthole bit that the strips were in the way and I wouldn't be able to get it to sit flush against the hat. Luckily for me, I had used hot glue, so I was able to cut the strip where I wanted, heat it up with my glue gun, and pull that silly little bit away. That's better. I glued the edges of my silvery tube together, and then jammed the fan duct thing right down inside. That way I could follow the edge curve with my knife so the tube would match the inside contour of my hat when I put it together. And then I pulled it out and pushed it back in, just not quite as far. I pushed the tube into the hole in the hat and messed around with it a whole bunch until it was just perfect. I used super glue to glue the plastic to the top hat and a shot of hot glue to hold the tube in place on the inside. I took a minute to make sure my head actually fit into the hat with the tube installed. It did, so I could continue my tube installation by gluing it and then cutting it off flush with the back of the hat. And I finished it off with some swirly porthole goodness. I glued the regulator where all good regulators go, and the 3 wire connector pieces to the side of the fan duct. Now that looks like a machine. But this machine, for some random reason, also needs a smokestack. Handily, I've added these smokestack pieces to the flared top hat pattern. I did the standard tracing and cutting moves that I always do, and then glued the edges of the pieces to make 2 tubes and a cone. You'll notice I actually overlap the edges of the cone piece just to make it look a little more handmade. I traced the end of my short green tube onto the hat and cut a hole. I then glued the angled edges of the smokestack tubes together. Depending which way you attach the shorter piece, you can have the seam either to the front or the back. I chose the front for that classic I just riveted this hat together myself look. And of course the cone goes on top. Now there's no way this hat could possibly work without some wires. I cut some 12mm and 6mm discs from craft foam and glued them together. These would be the fittings where the wires go into the hat. I used a skewer to make the hole in the center, and once I had the wire bent how I liked it, I glued it into place. I'm using some leftover telephone wire here, but you can use whatever you like. Just to make sure the wires stayed in place, I also glued them onto the hat wherever they made contact. I then held up my hat on a ruler and rotated it around so you could see where the wires went. I'm not sure why the ruler. Now it's time for rivets, and I used 5-minute 2-part epoxy. This is by far my favorite way of making rivets, although there's lots of others. And one day I plan to make a video showing all of them, so maybe just remind me of that. Anyways, the main key with what I'm doing here is to mix small batches of epoxy, and once it starts getting too stringy, stop and mix up a new batch. Once the epoxy had cured, I painted the whole thing black. I used Plata FX paint on the brim because it's a flexible paint, and if it's going to get bent somewhere, it's going to be on the brim. I used regular artist's acrylic paints for the rest of the hat because I wasn't so worried about it cracking on those parts. Once my 3 coats of paint were dry, I could add my metallic finishes. I made a 50-50 mix of silver and pewter, and used the same finger painting technique I used earlier to transform it from a foam top hat to a metal top hat. In places where I accidentally got silver and didn't want it, I repainted it black at the end. I finished up using vintage brass on all the rest of the parts. I even made a sweet paper shield so I could do those foam dots without getting the brass onto the silver. Smart idea, Chris. On goes the propeller and a teeny tiny bit of glue to hold on the spindle cap. Now all that was left to do was try it out in the wind.
Steampunk wind power top hat. It works.
I guess that's it. Fancy top hat. I think it looks pretty amazing. And even if you don't have access to a 3D printer, you could still put something cool in here, like a clock, a cuckoo clock, ball of some sort, a tennis ball, a baseball, globe. You can put a little door on there that opens like a hobbit hole, a can of pop, store a half-used roll of toilet paper in there, a little snack, not at the same time, probably, maybe an instrument, like an ocarina. So many things. Anyways, if you want to grab the pattern for the flared top hat, I've also updated it to include the smokestack there. You can get that by clicking a link either here somewhere or in the upper right corner or in the description or in the comments. I'm sure you can find it. Also, the 3D printed parts are available for free right now on Thingiverse. I'll include links for them as well. Oh, and if you like my patterns, make sure to check out my Ultimate Everything Super Value Bundle. It's all my foam patterns I've ever made, and it includes any future ones I make, all for a super good price, which I forget at the moment. But it's a good price. So check it out. Thanks for watching. See ya. a tomato, some hot dogs, a bag of small pebbles,